Continuing our reading of The Ecology of Freedom by Murray Bookchin. We are in episode 2, The Outlook of Organic Societies. On the printed version on the book, it's page 124. In any case, some 10,000 years ago, in an area between the Caspian Sea and the Mediterranean, nomadic bands of hunter-gatherers began to develop a crude system of horticulture and settle down in small villages, where they engage in mixed farming. They were followed quite independently some 4,000 or 5,000 years later in a similar development by Indians of central Mexico. The development of horticulture or gardening was probably initiated by women. Evidence for this belief comes from studies of mythology and from existing pre-literate communities based on a gardening technology. In this remote period of transition, when a sense of belonging to a relatively fixed soil community increasingly replaced a nomadic outlook, social life began to acquire entirely new unitary qualities that, to borrow a term devised by Erich Fromm, can best be called matricentric. By using this term, I do not wish to imply that women exercise any form of institutional sovereignty over men or achieved a commanding status in the management of society. I merely mean that the community, in separating itself from a certain degree of dependence on game and migratory animals, began to shift its social imagery from the male hunter to the female wood gatherer, from the predator to the protector, from the campfire to the domestic hearth, from cultural traits associated with the father to those associated with the mother. Going to the footnotes. Since these lines were first printed in 1970, a number of works have been published that push back certain features of this image of the Paleolithic hunting-gathering period of human development and even earlier, or more remote humanoid foraging stage, allowing for a number of differences between them. These writers generally view hunting-gathering communities as truly pacific, egalitarian, and probably matricentric societies. This image is sharply contrasted by the modern farmer's world, in my view, patently colored by the traits of more modern, tight-fisted peasants, centered around a calculating, stolid, and sullen male, to borrow Paul Shepard imagery, who presides over a large, obedient family that has been lured from a more carefree life based on hunting to a hard-working, day-long discipline based on food cultivation. Marshall Challis has even described the hunting-gathering Stone Age economy as the original affluent society, insomuch as needs were so few, the toolkit so simple, and the accoutrements of life so portable that men, at least, enjoyed very leisurely lives and considerable personal autonomy. Elizabeth Fisher has carried this pristine image of hunting-gathering to a point where she argues that matriarchy reality existed only when men did not associate coitus with conception. Interesting. An association that first occurred when seeds were planted in the soil and animals bred, more accurately, in my view, selected for their docility. Interesting, this connection between human relation to animal and how they view themselves and organize themselves. I do not share these views. Indeed, I not only find them simplistic but regressive, leaving aside the significance of such crucial social developments as writing, urbanity, advanced crafts techniques, and even the rudiments of society, none of which could have been developed by Paleolithic nomads. I hold that the case for hunting-gathering as humanity's golden age is totally lacking in evolutionary promise. But an analytical exercise, an analytical excursus into the issues raised by Shepard, Shalin, and Fisher does not belong in general work of this kind. However, it cannot be ignored at a time when the need for a new civilization threatens to evoke atavistic. I don't know what that is. Atavistic. Atavistic. Relating to or characterized by reversion, something ancient or ancestral. Like going back to something. Okay. However, it cannot be ignored at a time when the need for a new civilization threatens to evoke atavistic feelings against any kind of civilization. Indeed, to foster a new survivalist movement that is antisocial, if not fascistic, in character. Let me note that this trend is not a return to the supposed self-sufficiency of the Paleolithic hunter, with all his alleged virtues, but a descent into the depths of bourgeoisie egotism, with its savage ideology of the lifeboat ethics. As for the more... Sorry. I don't know why I'm so... As for the more readable and well-argued accounts of the hunting-gathering case, the reader should consult Marshall Shalin's Stone Age Economics, New York's Haddon's, Paul Shepard's The Tender Carnivore and the Sacred Game, Charles Charnibal, Elizabeth Fisher's Woman Creation, and so on and so forth. Okay. So, yeah, I think he's kind of talking about there's this kind of myth that human development, I mean, I'm going specifically by what he kind of elaborated in a footnote, that there is this kind of linear development. On the one hand, we have this notion that there was some linear development in which, you know, human beings started hunting-gathering societies, which were generally matriarchal, and then developed into more urbanized societies with agriculture, and then became more patriarchal, and so on and so forth. Which is something that is quite contradicted by more recent development and discoveries. I think we've mentioned David Graeber quite a few times here. But he's also warning from this other kind of almost reactionary response that is going to look at our ancestors as like something to go back to in this kind of what he calls atavistic survivalist movement that is antisocial, if not fascist in character. That makes me think a lot about, you know, I see this kind of a very apparent movement of people who go into like the response to the uncertainty that is happening in the world is to go into living in, doing the kind of off-grid lifestyle, but in a very individualistic, egotistic way, in a very kind of self-sufficient, kind of libertarian fashion. And of the time, for my kind of association with some of these people and kind of just seeing them online and offline, there is also a lot of the other kind of stuff, like, you know, patriarchy, chauvinism, racism, all kinds of stuff that is associated with that. So it's interesting. He's kind of, as he elaborates these previous societies and how they saw things and how they developed, he's also warning from this. And he did it quite a few times so far, of this kind of thinking about the noble savage or regressing this kind of past. In any case, these previous societies were certainly more matricentric and led by women. The change in emphasis is primarily cultural. Certainly, home and mother are written over every phase of Neolithic agriculture. Observers Louis Mumford's at the beginning. Certainly, home and mother are written over every phase of Neolithic agriculture, observes Louis Mumford, and not least over the new village centers, at least identifiable in the foundations of houses and graves. One can agree with Mumford that it was women who probably tended the garden crops and accomplished these masterpieces of selection and cross-fertilization, which turned raw wild species into the prolific and richly nutritious domestic variants. It was women who made the first containers, weaving baskets and coiling the first clay pots. Without this long period of agricultural and domestic development, the surplus of food and manpower that made urban life possible would not have been forthcoming. Going again to the footnotes. Whether many edible plants varieties were consciously selected or developed spontaneously under conditions of civilization is arguable. Eric Isaac and C.D. Darlington incline towards the view that spontaneous selection accounted for the early development of cereals and other plant varieties. Levi Strauss, on the other hand, contends that most of the technological advances achieved by Neolithic agriculture, including transforming a weed into cultivated plant, required a genuinely scientific attitude, sustained and watchful interest, and a desire for knowledge for its own sake. The pre-literate communities achieved a remarkably sensitive and knowledgeable adaptation to their environment is certainly true, but a watchful interest, nourished by grim need, is a far cry from a genuinely scientific attitude, which even an Archimedes lacked during the heights of the Hellenistic era. Today, one would want to replace some Mumford's words, such as his sweeping use of agriculture, which men were to extend beyond women's discovery of gardening into the mass production of food and animals. We would want to confine home and mother to early phases of the Neolithic rather than every phase. Similarly, where the selection of edible plants varieties and cross-fertilization for new ones begin, is a highly blurred interface in the prehistoric of food cultivation. But the spirit of Mumford's remarks is even more valid today than it was 2 decades ago, when a heavy-handed male-oriented anthropology would have rejected it as sentimental. If anything, women's stature in inscribing her sensibilities and her hands on the beginnings of human history has grown rather than diminished. It was she who, unlike any other living creature, made the sharing of food a consistent communal activity, and even a hospitable one that embraced the stranger, hence fostering sharing as a unique human desideratum. Birds and mammals, to be sure, feed their young and exhibit extraordinary protectiveness on their behalf. Among mammals, females provide the produce of their bodies in the form of milk and warmth, but only women but only woman, was to make sharing a universally social phenomenon to the point where her young, as siblings, then male and female adults, and finally parents, became sharers, irrespective of their sex and age. It is she who turned sharing into a hallowed communal imperative, not merely an episodic or marginal feature. Finally, we cannot ignore the fact that women's foraging activities helped awaken in humanity an acute sense of place, of oikos. Her nurturing sensibility helped create not only the origins of society, but literally the roots of civilization. A terrain that male has arrogantly claimed for himself. Here, stake in civilization was different from that of the predatory male. It was more domestic, more pacifying, and more caring. The sensibility ran deeper and was laden with more than the male's, for she embodied in her very physical being mythology's ancient message of a lost golden age, a fecund nature. Yet ironically, she has been with us all the time with a special genius and mystery, one whose potentialities have been brutally diminished, but ever present as a voice of conscientious in the bloody cauldron that men have claimed for their civilization. Benign qualities nurtured in the Neolithic world, are perhaps no less significant than its material achievements. A close association exists between communal management of land and matrilineal descent in surviving gardening cultures. Clan society, perhaps a slow reworking of totemic cults in hunting bands, may have reached its apogee in this period, and with it, a communal disposition of the land and its products. To live with had probably become to share, if the two expressions were ever different in their meaning. The remains of early Neolithic villages, we often sense the existence of what was once a clearly peaceful society, strewn with symbols of the fecundity of life and the bounty of nature. Although there is evidence of weapons, defensive palisades, and protective ditches, early horticulturists seem to have emphasized peaceful arts and sedentary pursuits. Judging from the building sites and graves, there is little evidence, if any, that social inequality existed within these communities, or that warfare marked the relationship between them. Presiding over this remote world was the figure and symbolism of the mother goddess, a fertility principle so old in time that its stone remains have even been found in Paleolithic caves and encampments. Hunter-gatherers, early horticulturalists, advanced agriculturalists, and the priests of high civilization have imparted utterly contradictory traits to her, some deliciously benign, others darkly demonic. But it is more than fair to assume that in the early Neolithic, the priests had not yet sculpted the cruel, Kali-like image into her figure. Apparently, like Demeter, she was more of a feminine principle, latent with loving and mourning, not the mere fertility symbol, the magic thing that endeared her to hunter-gatherers. That she could not remain untainted by patriarchy is obvious from the reading of the Odyssey, in which the island-hopping seafarer debase women and her domain to crude catatonic enchantress who devour the trusting warrior in distress. but strongly reinforces interpretations of the goddess as a more giving principle is the unqualified nature of mother love itself, in contrast to a conditional love associated with patriarchy. Eric Fromm, in the provocative essays he prepared for the Institute for Social Research, noted that women's love, compared with that of the judgmental patriarch who provides love as a reward for the child's performance and fulfillment of its duties, is not dependent of any moral or social obligation to be carried out by the child. There is not even an obligation to return her love. This unconditional love, without exception of any filial reward, yields the total objectification of person that makes humanness its own end rather than a tool for hierarchy and classes. To assume that the goddess did not symbolize this untainted sense of identification is to question her association with feminine. In short, to turn her into a god, which priestly corporations were to do later with extraordinary deftness. Odysseus, in degrading Demeter to Circe, also reveals how the lovely sirens might have charmed humans and beasts into a sense of commonality with each other. Homer's epic, however, will forever hide from us the intriguing possibility that their song originally gave to humanity the music of life rather than the luring melody of death. I love how he's weaving together this kind of, you know, historical facts, but also poetic prose. It's very, very good. So yeah, basically we are seeing how matricentric societies were far from kind of meaning that women have some kind of power and hierarchy, but rather they were the very principle of feminine and the actions of women themselves, how taking care of their siblings and their children turned into taking care of stranger was the very foundation of civilization, and how human societies form. And then he ends with this beautiful kind of poetic prose of how the image of the symbol of the mother goddess was originally a symbol of that very kind of civilization making feminine principle, but then turned into this more kind of warlike, like Kali and Demeter and the sirens that kind of tempt the enchantress, that tempt the sailors and then kill them, but rather instead of the kind of potential for the intriguing possibility that her song originally gave to humanity the music of life rather than luring melody of death, which is very kind of symbolic of how those who write history write it as according to their own logics, their own mythologies. How men wrote the civilization created by them, and great mother figures that are violent and warlike rather than caregivers. And he also talks about the unconditional love, which I found really beautiful to bring here. Anyway, what do you guys make of it? Also, hi Franco. Nice that you joined us.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about like what I guess scholars call like cult prostitution in the ancient Near East, or like Jesus consorting with prostitutes, and like what sex work is in relation to what caring is, and how culturally what we look at as like intimacy and sex and physical closeness, um and the role that that plays and how it is sort of like it is like pure when it's freely given, or it's like somehow not when there is some exchange of money, as though like there is any sexual encounter that doesn't have an exchange of um power. Or yeah, I don't know, I'm thinking just thinking about that generally, is uh and the notion of like, you know, men not connecting procreation is connected to sex, right? And how that shifts dynamics as well. Not really any coherent, just like things I'm thinking about.
Yeah, I mean, he did mention something like that. How it's like potentially when sex become inseparable from procreation rather than this for the sake of itself. I don't know where it was, but we read something like that. It was in the footnote somewhere. Yeah, I'm curious, like what specifically in what we read made you think about sex work?
I think just the mention of goddesses and like the transition of like the written record of what we have of, the perception of goddesses and you know, the divine feminine through a patriarchal lens
Mm.
versus like the bits and pieces that we have of like what what the divine feminine was pre-patriarchy. I feel like it's like a lot of reading between the lines of patriarchal texts and imagining um what the divine feminine would be, and how sanitized, right? Even like, you know, like looking at like the Virgin Mary, like the only way that you can have a divine feminine figure is through you know, sexual purity
Yeah.
versus like a reality of, you know, every every living, well, I shouldn't say, right? Like every living thing that is the product of sexual reproduction goes through a female body, right? Or a body that has, right, what we would call like female reproductive organs, right? Like so just thinking about like the role that the divine feminine like has played over time, and how that power kind of got pulled away and away and away, right? To the point where like we have notions of the divine feminine, you know, in Judaism and through the Shekhinah, but it's like very kind of buried, right? Like it's like not sort of in the mainstream. And just also again with like the notion of like there were like cult prostitutes, right? There were like temples of that like people would go and receive like what we, you know, in modern society would think of as like, you know, sex for payment, right? But like it was definitely different. And like the notion of what was that, right? Like what was that experience of that type of exchange? I don't know. I'm thinking about like just it's hard to even imagine, right, that a holy place could be a place of like sexual exchange as like sanctioned by society.
Yeah. Yeah, their conceptions of sexuality, I think maybe we haven't explored in super depth in this book, but there was like a mention of it in some of our previous readings, like how even our notions of monogamy or polyamory are not quite adequate to describe the kind of cosmology and ontologies that they had and held around sexuality and what it is in the social sphere. And together with that is also like just what we read in the footnote before. He's mentioning Elizabeth Fisher, that has carried this pristine image of hunting gathering to a point where she argues that matriarchy really existed only when men did not associate coitus with conception. An association that first occurred when seeds were planted in the soil and animals bred, more accurately, in my view, selected for their docility. But he says that he do not share these views. Indeed, I not only find them simplistic but regressive, leaving aside the significance of such crucial social developments as writing, urbanity, um, early advanced crafts and techniques, and even the rudiment of science, none of which could have been developed by Paleolithic nomads. I hold that the case for hunting gathering as humanity's golden age is totally lacking in evolutionary promise. There is also this that is, I feel like it's kind of like it's a more expansive, kind of more nuanced view as we are learning about these earlier societies, but also kind of like a warning because I find it also in myself, like I do it all the time, like this kind of a regressive kind of. It's very easy when we are talking about things like decolonization and we gather here to study these earlier societies. So this whole book is about looking back so we can articulate new planetary stories, but then at the same time not do it in a way that is regressive to kind of romanticize this kind of, because a lot of these magnificent sciences and arts and techniques could not have been developed in hunting gathering societies. So there is also this, yeah. um and at the same time, you know all that we are doing here is like looking back and be like, oh, that's a human possibility. It's interesting. How can we hold both? And more than anything, understand the process rather than, oh, this bad, this good, humans are X because Y, and all these kind of oversimplistic binarities in which we are used to experiencing our own reality and looking at previous societies, but instead really try to explore the process itself of how these things evolve into each other, how these societies evolve into each other, and also the kind of worldviews and ontologies and cosmologies that these different societies held, and how some of them are still preserved today, and how they can all come together and play into new human possibilities. And I think that's really what is it. It's like we can look at this. Yeah. Anyway, Panko says that he gotta stay muted today, so maybe we continue finish this episode for today, and then we have the next episode, the emergence of hierarchy. That's gonna be a fun one. Okay, so maybe for today we can just finish this episode.
Sounds good. Thank you.
How close the early Neolithic village walls may have been to that of the early Pueblo Indians, which the most hardened white invaders were to describe in such glowing terms, we may never be known. How close the early Neolithic villages world may have been to that of the early Pueblo Indians, which the most hardened white invaders were to describe in such glowing terms, may never be known. Yet, I mean, I don't know if I agree with that. I mean, there's plenty of existing people right now that are descendants of these earlier people. A lot of old traditions and customs, but yeah. Yet the thought lingers that at the dawn of history, a village society has emerged in which life seemed to be unified by a communal disposition of work and its products, by a procreative relationship with the natural world, one that found overt expression in fertility rites, by a pacification of the relationships between humans and the world around them. The hunter-gatherers may have left the world virtually untouched, aside from the grasslands they cleared for the great herds. But such an achievement is safely marked by its absence of activity. There is a want of environmental artistry, of a landscape that has been left the better for humanity's presence, one that has the breath of mind as well as spirit bestowed upon it. Today, when the hunter-gatherer's mere parasitism of the environment has emerged as a virtue in juxtaposition to contemporary man's insane exploitation, we tend to fetishize restraint to the point of passivity and undoing and non-doing. Yet the matricentric horticulturists manage to touch the earth and change it, but with grace, delicacy, and feeling that may be regarded as evolution's own harvest. Ooh, that's a good one. I want to mark this. The matricentric horticulturists manage to touch the earth and change it, but with grace, delicacy, and feeling that may be regarded as evolution's own harvest. Or like parts of the evolutionary process itself. Their archaeology is no exception, their archaeology is an expression of human outfulness and natural fulfillment. Neolithic artifacts seem to reflect a communion of humanity and nature that patently express the communion of human with each other, a solidarity of the community with the world of life that articulated an intense solidarity within the community itself. As long as this internal solidarity persisted, nature was its beneficiary. When it began to decay, the surrounding world began to decay with it, and hence came the long winter time of domination and oppression we normally call civilization. And not much more to add, huh? Right. Now, our next reading, we can start episode 3, The Emergence of Hierarchy. And for now, thank you for joining. Whoever is listening to the recording, thank you for joining as well. If you are not already part of our Discords, then join us. There's a lot more than those readings that you can benefit from and engage with. And of course, as always, if you want to support me on Patreon, that will be much, much appreciated.